Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. And today I'm going to be going over the 2024 results and the polling aggregates and apply the 2020 polling errors from every single state to see what the result would end up being. Make sure to hit the like button and subscribe if you're new, and make sure to follow the Twitter and join the Discord in the description down below. And so for the first state we're going to be seeing is the state of Alabama. Donald Trump was able to win this state by 25 points in the 2020 election. He is currently up by an average of around 23 percentage points. If we look at the aggregate in 2020, we'll see Donald Trump was up by 19 points, and he ended up winning by 25.5%, so an exact 6-point underestimation for Donald Trump. And so if you were to average this out, it gives around 22 point margin for Trump. That puts the state at a 27-point win, 28-point win for the former president. As of right now, the state of Alaska, in the latest poll, he's ahead by 19 points. So if you were to average this all out, he's probably ahead by 15 to 16 points. The aggregate in 2020 only had him up by 7.7. He ended up winning by 10.1. So that would end up putting the state at around a 20 point win for the 2024 presidential election. If we look at the state of Arizona, Donald Trump is up by 2.3% in the aggregate. Biden won it by 0.31 points in 2020. Biden was up by 2.6 in the aggregate and only ended up winning it by 0.3, which is a 2.3 overestimation in favor of Biden. And so if you were to apply that here, Donald Trump would pretty much be up in the aggregate by almost 5 percentage points. He'd be up in the state by around 4.7, 4.8 percentage points as of right now. If you look at the state of Arkansas, Donald Trump is up by 32 points, 25 points. That's a 28 point average. And if you look at 2020, the aggregate has Donald Trump winning it by 22 percentage points. And if we were to pull up, the map from 2020, we're going to see he ended up winning it by 27.6 percentage points. And so that's a 5-point underestimation for Trump. And so that puts the state in the safe column and more than likely gives him around a 32 point win in the state or so. The next state's going to be the state of California, where Biden actually performed right in line with the aggregate. The aggregate was actually spot on 538. And so based off of that, we could give Biden a plus 21 point margin for the 2024 presidential election based on the polling. If we were to go to the state of Colorado, Biden ends up probably averaging out to 7 or 8 points based on the latest polls from February and March. He probably ends up averaging out to 7 or 8 points. If you look at 2020, he was ahead by 12.5 points. He ended up winning by 13.5. So that puts him at around a 9 or 10 point victory. For the sake of the video, we're going to put him in the likely column, probably leave it at a 9-point win for him as of right now. The next state is going to be the state of Connecticut, where Biden ended up winning by 20. The aggregate had him up 6.3 percentage points higher than that, and Biden is ahead in the latest poll by 9 points from October as of right now. And the latest poll, if you were to kind of add it all up, he's ahead by 13 points. That's kind of a 10 to 11 point lead in the aggregate as of right now. And so because of that, if you were to apply that 6.3 overestimation for Biden, Donald Trump would actually barely be ahead in the state by a likely margin. He'd be ahead by around 5 points as of right now in the state of Connecticut. If we were to go ahead and look at Delaware, Biden in the latest poll, if you were to put this together, it'd be a 10-point lead from the two Kennedy polls. If you look, he was ahead by 24 in the state. Delaware, he only won it by 19. That's almost a 5-point overestimation, and so that puts the state in the likely Democratic column at a +5 victory for Biden, similar to Connecticut as of right now. If you look at the District of Columbia, there's no new polling data, but based out of there and the last result from the previous election, we could put it in the safe Democratic column, as I don't expect the polling error to be that large. Donald Trump's ahead by 9.3 percentage points. He was able to win it by 3.4% in 2020, and in 2020, Biden was ahead by 2.5 percentage points on election day, which is about a 5-point miss in the general election polling. That would put the state in a plus 14 percentage point column for Trump, which would put the state in the safe Republican column. If we were to look at Georgia, Donald Trump's currently ahead by 5.3%. And if you look at the aggregate, Biden was ahead by 1.2. He ended up winning by 0.24, a point overestimation for Biden. If we look at here, he was able to win a 0.24%. And so that would put the state as a 6-point victory for Donald Trump, according to the polling error from 2020 and applying it to the 2024 aggregate. If we were to look at the state of Hawaii, Biden's actually up by 8 percentage points. And if we look at the aggregate here, Biden was ahead 34.3%. As of right now, in the aggregate, he ended up winning by 29.5%, around a 5-point overestimation. And so that would actually put the state of Hawaii in the lead Democratic column in this video, because of the fact that he got overestimated by 5 points here. He's only up by 8 points in the latest poll with third-party votes. And because of that large, polling error, pretty much that puts the state below a 5-point victory, and it's only a 3-point win for Biden as of right now. If you were to look at Idaho, Donald Trump's ahead by 29 points. If we look at the aggregate in 2020, he was ahead by 18. He ended up winning by about 30. So that puts the state of Idaho as like a 40-point win or so for the 2024 election. If you look at Illinois, Biden was ahead by 16 in the aggregate. He ended up winning by 17 points as of right now. And if you look at 2024, Biden is currently ahead by 9 points, 10, 20 back in August. However, theoretically, April would be the latest poll. And if you were to look at this, it's only plus 9 for Trump as of right now. And so that would put the state exactly as a 10-point win, since Trump got overestimated by a point in the aggregate in the 2020 election. And so if we were to keep going, we'd see Indiana as a state where Donald Trump is up considerably, 19 points. And back then, he was ahead only by 10 points in the aggregate. He ended up winning by 16. So that puts the state as like a 26-point win for the former president as of right now. If we look at Iowa, Donald Trump was up by 1.3%. In 2020, he ended up winning by 8.2% in 2020, and so that's around a 7-point underestimation of Donald Trump. Donald Trump in the latest aggregate would probably be ahead by 12-13 points right now, and so that puts the state even further into the safe Republican column, putting it as an 18-19 point win for the former president. And if we were to look at Kansas, Donald Trump has had 16, 14, 16, more than likely would average out to around 15 points or so. Donald Trump in the 2020 aggregate was only ahead by 12.9%. He ended up winning by 14.6, 2-point underestimation. That puts the state further into the safe Republican column. And if we were to look at the next state, the state of Kentucky, Donald Trump's ahead by 15.7. He ended up winning by 25.9, which is a huge underestimation of the former president. Donald Trump is currently up in the state by quite a bit. He is up in the state by about 25 points or so. And so that would put Donald Trump winning it by over 30 points in the 2020 presidential election. Louisiana, almost the same thing. Donald Trump's up by 15 points, 14, 15. Up by quite a bit in some of these aggregates. He led by 20.6%. He ended up winning by 18.6%. So that's a 2-point overestimation for him. So funny enough, he'd actually be winning the state by only about 12.5%, which is pretty weird that it'd be voting to the left of Iowa and Ohio and Florida. That's kind of appalling to me as a whole, but it is still in the safe Republican column nonetheless. If you look at the state of Maine, Trump is up by 6 percentage points in the at-large vote, and in the aggregate, Biden was ahead by 13 points, and he only ended up winning it by 9.1, which is around a 4-point overestimation of Biden. And so that would actually put the state at a plus 10 margin for Trump, which actually puts him in the safe Republican column there. And based off the previous results, we could probably put Maine's first in the likely Democratic column and Maine second in the safe Republican column as of right now. And Maine at large would actually be safe Republican, which is very, very interesting to see it be safe Republican. If you look at Maryland, Biden's ahead by 17 points. In 2020, the aggregate had him up 29.7 points. He ended up winning by 33.2, so it underestimated Biden. And if we look at that, that'd probably give him around a 21-point win in the state of Maryland. And if we kept going to Massachusetts, we'd see Biden's ahead, 30, 18, 25. That probably averages around, a 26, 25-point lead in the aggregate. He ended up winning by 33%. The aggregate had him up by 35, so that's a 2-point overestimation. So he probably would end up winning the state by 23 points as of right now, slightly more than the state of Maryland, which would check out electorally. Michigan, Biden was ahead by 7.9. He only ended up winning by 2.8, which is a 5-point overestimation of Biden. Trump's currently ahead by 0.8, and so that would put the state in the likely Republican column at plus 5.9 for Donald Trump in the next election. If we look at Minnesota, Trump's actually ahead in the aggregate. I'd say he's probably ahead by, I'd say he's ahead 3, 5, even 2. I'd say he's probably ahead by like a point or so in the aggregate, which is fairly interesting. And the aggregate had Biden winning it by 9.2. He ended up winning it by around 7.1, 2-point overestimation for Biden. And so that would end up being a 3-point win in the state of Minnesota for the former president, which would be right along his Arizona victory, which would show that Arizona would be trending ridiculously to the left. And so Mississippi, Donald Trump's winning it fairly easily. He won it by 16 points. He's ahead by 18. In 2020, the aggregate was 15.9, so that's a 3-point underestimation of him. So the victory is going to be right around that 19-point victory margin for Donald Trump. Missouri, he was only ahead by 8 in the aggregate. He ended up winning by 15. That's around a 7-point miss. Donald Trump's ahead by well over double digits. That would put the state in the mid-20s as of right now for a victory there. Montana, Donald Trump's up the aggregate by above 20 points. In the 2020 aggregate, he was only ahead by 4.4. He ended up winning by 16.4. So that puts the state in the 30s percentage point victory if you were to apply that big of a polling miss. And what's actually quite funny about that is basically Tester would have no chance at winning the general Senate election if Donald Trump was really winning the state by close to 30 percentage points. The next state is going to be the state of Nebraska, where Donald Trump leads by 23 in the latest poll. He ended up winning the at-large vote by 19, and in 2020, he was actually down by 3.8%. So there is a huge polling error. If we look at Nebraska in general, Donald Trump was up 13, 10.65. So the aggregate was probably like plus 8. He ended up winning 19, so that's around a 10-point miss there. So he'd end up winning the state of Nebraska by 33 points as of right now, which is fairly interesting. And if we look at Nebraska's second, we're going to see some polling out of there. But Nebraska's second was a 3.8 percentage point lead for Biden. He actually ended up winning it by 6.6%. And so that's around a 3-point miss there, and basically in favor of Trump. And so unfortunately for Trump, this 3-point lead, it basically gets cut down to a tilt margin in Nebraska's second, despite crazy margins in a state like Michigan, Minnesota, and Maine at large. If we were to go to Nevada, Donald Trump is up in the aggregate by 4.5%. If we look at 2020, he was up by 5.3. He ended up winning the state by 2.4. Well, that's around a 3-point overestimation for Biden. And so that would put the state in the likely Republican column at a 7.5-point win for the former president. If we were to look at New Hampshire, Biden more than likely would be up in the aggregate by around 4 to 5 points. If we look at 2020, he won it by 7.4. The 2020 aggregate currently had the race at 11.4, so that's a 4-point miss. And so that would put the state of New Hampshire as a 1 percentage point victory for Joe Biden as of right now. And if we were to keep going to the next state, New Jersey, Biden in the latest poll is up 5 points with third-party votes. And what's interesting is that if we were actually go to 2020, he was ahead in the aggregate by 20.4. He ended up winning the state by 15.9%. And so that's roughly a 5-point miss. And so if you were to apply that polling error, Biden would actually only be winning New Jersey by a tilt margin. So according to the polling misses, New Jersey and Nebraska would be voting on the same level nationally, or at least Nebraska's second, and it would be voting to the right of New Hampshire, which is also pretty interesting as well. If we were to go to New Mexico, he was up by 11.7. He ended up winning the race by 10.8. So it's around a point overestimation for Biden. The latest aggregate would probably have Biden up by like 8 or 9 points. And so that puts the state as a 7-point win for the incumbent president. If we were to go to the state of New York, Biden in the latest poll is actually up by 19 points with registered voters without third-party votes. But over here, we'd see Biden up 10, 10, 12, 9, 9. So the aggregate probably sits at around, 13 at 12 points as of right now, maybe 14 points. And if we look at 2020, Biden was up in the state aggregate by 29.4. He ended up winning by 23.1. So that's a 6-point overestimation for Biden. And so if he's up by 13 or 14, that actually puts the state in the likely Democratic column. He'd actually only be up in the state by 8 or 9 points. And so that would put the state in a somewhat competitive margin for 2024. If we were to look at the state of North Carolina, Biden would be up by 1.8. Trump ended up winning by 1.3. That's around a 3 to 4 point miss in favor of Biden. And so but Trump is currently leading by 5.9. And so that puts the state in the safe Republican column ever so slightly when you apply the polling error from 2020. If we were to go to the state of North Dakota, Donald Trump's up by 37. Donald Trump was up by 17 points in the aggregate. He was ahead by 33. That would put the state in like the 50s for Donald Trump at this point. Ohio, Trump was up by 0.8 in the aggregate, and he ended up winning by basically 8 points, and Donald Trump's up by 9.6. So if you were to apply that 8-point polling miss to Trump's margin, he'd actually end up winning the state of Ohio by around 17 points, kind of similar to Iowa in this scenario. And if we go to Oklahoma, Trump's up 30, 33, 8, 28, 29. In 2020, he ended up leading the aggregate by 23 on election day. He ended up winning by 33 points. So essentially, it's a 10-point miss. So that puts Oklahoma in the plus 40 points of a margin of victory for the former president in this scenario. If we look at Oregon, Biden was ahead by 20.1 or 21.3. He ended up winning by 16.1. So that's around a 5-point miss in favor of Biden. The latest poll has Biden ahead by 11, 12, 15. So that ends up running under 13. So 13 minus 5 is roughly around 8 points. That puts the state as an 8-point win for the incumbent president. If we were to go to Pennsylvania, Trump is up by 1.4%. And if we look at the 2020 aggregate, Biden was ahead by 4.7. He ended up winning the state by 1.2. So that's around a 3.5-point miss there. And so if you were to apply that to the 2020 aggregate, that puts the state right below the 5-point victory in this scenario, which is also quite interesting as well. Rhode Island is a 17 and 14-point win. That puts the state around a 15-point-ish margin for the incumbent president. The aggregate in 2020 had him up by 30.6 percentage points. He only ended up winning it by 20.8. And so that ends up actually moving the state all the way. If he's up plus 15, it's a 10-point miss. He's actually only up in Rhode Island by about 5 points as well. So it looks like there's a large shift in the northeastern area, which is quite interesting. If we look at South Carolina, Donald Trump up 14, 17, 22, 19. So it ends up averaging out at 20 points. He ended up winning by 11.7 in 2020. The aggregate had him up by 7.8%, 11-point miss or 4-point miss in favor of Biden. And so that puts the state well into the 20, point margins of victory for him there. If we look at South Dakota, Donald Trump up 29, 23, 21. That's around a 25-point aggregate. Donald Trump was up by 15.4. He ended up winning by 26. So that puts South Dakota in the 30-point margin of victories for the former president. If we look at Tennessee, Trump was up by 13.7. He ended up winning by 23.4, 23.2. So that's around a 10-point miss in favor of Biden. And all the aggregates basically show him as like a 24-point win. So that puts him in around the 30s in the margin of victory for that state. And the last state that's going to put Trump over the top is Texas. Right now, he's up by 9.9%. The aggregate in 2020 only had Trump up by 1.1. He ended up winning by 5.6, around a over 4-point overestimation for Biden. And so that puts the state in the pretty much the plus 14 column, kind of similar to Florida. So they vote kind of in line with each other. And that puts Trump not only above 270, but above 300 electoral votes in this scenario. Donald Trump is up 24 points and 28 points in the latest poll as of right now. And if we look at the aggregate error, Donald Trump won by 20 points in 2020, and in 2020 he was only up by 10.6. So that puts the state as like a 33-point win for Donald Trump in this election. Vermont was a 38-point lead for him in the aggregate. He ended up winning by 30.4, 3-point overestimation for Biden, and right now 31 and 30 are the margins of victory. So a 27.5 margin of victory for Biden would be pretty realistic in this scenario. If we go ahead and look at Virginia, the latest poll has Biden up by 4, 1, and 3 respectively. That averages out to about 2.53 points. Then you include 6 and 5. That averages out to around a 4 or 5 point margin of victory. Biden won it by 10.1 in 2020. The aggregate actually had him up 11.8, so he got overestimated by about a point. So that puts the state in the lean, a Democratic column, putting Joe Biden over 200 electoral votes. Now, Washington, he was up by 23. He ended up winning it by 19.2, so that's around a 4-point overestimation for Biden. The latest aggregate, I actually think, would probably end up having, it's kind of weird, but I'm actually going to do it on my calculator really quick. But I actually think that as of right now, if you were to have this aggregate, Biden would only be up by 5.2% in the aggregate in Washington, and around a 4-point miss here would actually end up putting Washington in the lean Democratic column for Biden at literally just a point of victory for the incumbent president, showing that Washington could potentially become a competitive state within polling in 2024. And if you go to West Virginia, Donald Trump is up 37 points in the aggregate. He was up by 28. He ended up winning by 38. So that would end up putting him in a 47-point victory for the presidency in 2024 here. If you look at Wisconsin, the last swing state, Donald Trump's up by 1.4%. If we look at 2020, he was up in the aggregate by about 8.4%. He ended up winning it by a tilt margin. So that is a huge overestimation for Biden, around an 8-point overestimation. That puts the state of Wisconsin in the likely category as of right now. And if we were to go to Wyoming, he's leading the aggregate by 31.5. He ended up winning by basically 43.4. He's up by 53. So that put the state as like a 60-something point win for the former president. And that puts Donald Trump at 325 electoral college votes to Joe Biden's 213, with states like Hawaii, Washington, New Jersey, Virginia, and New Hampshire possibly being competitive states for Donald Trump to pick up in the 2024 presidential election. If you guys did enjoy this quick video, please hit the thumbs up button and make sure to go ahead and subscribe, and make sure to follow the Twitter and join the Discord in the description down below. And I will see you guys very, very soon.